Hi everyone and welcome to the first online lecture for HL 20490. This is the lecture that goes along with week 2's content, so today you're going to be looking at literature reviews. This lecture is backed up by a series of examples of literature reviews that are available on Moodle, as well as an online quiz that you need to complete to accompany your slide knowledge that you gain from this PowerPoint. So today we're going to look at different databases for gaining the data you need, or as in the research articles you need to complete your literature review. We're going to look at how to refine your keywords from your research question. We're going to look at the actual process of searching for articles and how we siphon out what's relevant and what isn't. And finally we're going to look at the actual process of writing up a concise literature review. So we've got some generic learning outcomes for you from today. By engaging with this lecture, readings and activities, by the end of it you should be able to use the Boolean system to improve the quality of your database search results, systematically source academic material that is relevant and appropriate to your research topic, synthesize information from a variety of sources and write it out concisely, and pinpoint gaps in the literature and elaborate how your research adds to this. So, as you know, one of the most important tasks that you have to undertake in the early stages of research is a review of the literature relating to your research problem. Careful consideration at this stage is crucial, as the way you organise your note-taking and information storage will have repercussions in terms of both the management of your time and the quality of your results in the subsequent stages of each research process. Because a huge amount of relevant literature may be available, reviewing this literature ought to follow a systematic, meticulously designed process characterised by perceptive reading and an attention to detail, particularly that which relates to your research problem. Your reading will help you to become aware of how others have dealt with topics in your research subject, and of what knowledge they have acquired, and of how to collect data appropriate to your research problem. So what is a research literature review? A research literature review is a systematic, explicit, and reproducible method for identifying, evaluating, and synthesizing the existing body of completed and recorded work produced by researchers, scholars, and practitioners. A research review bases its conclusions on the original work of scholars and researchers. So, focusing on high-quality original research rather than on interpretations of the findings is the only guarantee you have that the results of the review will be under your supervision and accurate. So if you look into the literature on how to do a literature review, ironically, you'll find that most authors have divided the activity of creating a literature review into a series of subtasks. These all relate to your broader research project. The first thing you need to, and which you have already done, is to sediment your research question. Then you move on to choosing a specific bibliographic or article database. So this could be Google Scholar, it could be EBSCO, it could be the library catalogue. Basically, a bibliographic database is a collection of articles, books, and reports that can provide data to answer a research question. The database is usually accessed online. The bibliographic databases of interest in research reviews often contain full reports of original studies. So, like I said, we're thinking of things like Google Scholar and the library catalogue, not so much the general Google search engine. Other sources of literature reviews include experts in the field of interest. So, you could have reports that aren't necessarily being turned up through Google Scholar, but they are actually of quality information, and you can include these within your report. Once you've got a good body of literature that you've already searched for and saved in some way, then you can use the reference list contained within those articles as well to make sure that you haven't missed anything. So once you've identified your sources from where you're going to get your research information, you need to choose your search terms. So search terms are the words and phrases that you use to get appropriate articles, books, and reports. You base them on the words and concepts that frame the research question, and you use a particular grammar and logic to conduct that search. So this grammar and logic that we're talking about is the Boolean language, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. Once you've got your search terms, you then move on to screen your findings further. So you might have too many articles for it to be manageable for you to create any kind of written output from these. At this point, you can selectively take out certain articles that don't meet criteria that you have decided upon. Once you've got your selection of articles that you know you're going to use for your review, you need to actually review them, obviously. So that involves passing some kind of judgment on them. It involves synthesizing the information within them so that you can manageably look at it and compare it and contrast it to other articles. And it involves situating it within a specific academic context. So it could be the discipline, it could be sport and social science, it could be the time period, it could be an array of things like that. Finally, synthesizing your findings involves bringing them together into a coherent argument, but grouping different journal articles into sub-themes that deal with specific topics, different sub-themes that could be methodological, that could be theoretical, and comparing and contrasting what has been said by multiple authors on the same thing. At this stage, you're also going to situate your research project in relation to that literature. So, sedimenting your research question. At the end of yesterday's lecture, I kind of pointed you in the direction of thinking about how you might perfect your research question and refine it a little bit further compared to what it was last semester. At this stage, you might also be thinking about developing a whole new research question because you've got fed up with the project idea you already started. Either way, it doesn't really matter for the point of this exercise, but obviously, if you do the activities associated with this online lecture, you will already start to build up a bank of work that you can use for assignment number 2. If you make something up that's different, you won't be able to use it later on. If you've got a well-defined research question, it should conveniently provide you with the search terms you need to conduct your literature review. So here is my example that's just been arbitrarily picked from the air. Does exercise in green space improve mental well-being for healthcare home residents? For care home residents. Different journal articles and books that deal with methodology will call the search terms that you use either keywords, descriptors, or identifiers. But clearly we can see from my example that the keywords would be exercise, green space, mental health, and care home residents. At this stage that seems quite obvious. However, when we actually start to use these search terms, we might find that they're not as lucrative as we hoped they might be. So, for example, exercise might be used in other studies under the terminology of sport or specific sports. Green space, other studies might have, instead of using the words green space, might have used park, might have used woodland. Equally, mental health, that covers quite a broad area. Say I really actually only want to look at depression. In that case, I might want to search for mental health, I might want to search for depression, but then I might not want to gain results on dementia. So the way I structure my search is going to change quite significantly. We're going to look into Boolean logic on how to get around these issues. However, before we get into Boolean logic, we need to start thinking about which databases we're going to use to conduct our search. So most of the research that I do just on a general day-to-day basis, and most of the assignments that you do on a day-to-day basis, probably the Bath Library Catalogue or Google Scholar are going to be good enough for that. Even your assignment 2, they're probably going to be good enough sources of information to get a breadth of what you need to cover your subject area in enough detail. However, for your dissertations, these might not be the best routes to go down because they're quite limited in their functionality, in the way that you can refine different filters. And also they provide either results that are in the wrong language, that you don't actually have access to all of the time. Sometimes they provide information that isn't of the best quality, particularly with Google Scholar rather than the library catalogue. And they're also not very sophisticated tools. So you might start to think about using the Web of Science. The Web of Science is particularly usable within a health discourse, so that's a good way to go. And it's got a lot of different ways that you can refine your search that are more sophisticated than the library catalogue and Google Scholar. Ultimately, there's no right or wrong database to use. The thing that you're going to have to pay attention to when you do your literature review, at least for your dissertation, is that you use the same database search terms in whichever database you use, so that you can always replicate what you're doing at a later date, and this enforces the rigorousness of what you're doing. If you go onto the library website, you can find extra information and help on which databases are appropriate for the discipline of health or the department for health. And also, because what we do is largely social scientific, there's further help on the social science and social policy side of things, which might also be relevant to your research projects. Arguably, Web of Science is such a big database that you probably don't need to look elsewhere. However, it might be worth just doing so if you don't feel like you like the reusability of Web of Science. But anyway, it's up to you. You just need to make sure that you are consistent with your search terms and consistent with the way that you search, and also that you are explicit about which databases you use when you write up your findings. However, before we get into Boolean logic, so moving on to Boolean logic. What is Boolean logic? Well, it's actually a binary system that's used quite widely in physics, in engineering, and it relies on the combination of three words, and, or, and not. You might have come across this before, maybe in your A-level studies. But it basically means that by combining the words and, or not in a specific order within your search phrases, you are able to leave out all of the studies that aren't relevant to your project and bring in all of the ones supposedly that are relevant to your project. The more sophisticated you get at creating Boolean logic phrases, the more successful your literature searches will be. So ultimately then, Boolean involves combining and, or, and not to improve the quality of your search results. Together they build a logic. So the first term that we used within or amongst our key search terms that we've already identified is and. The use of and is used to retrieve a set of citations in which each citation contains all of the search terms. So it's quite obvious basically. If you search for exercise and green space and mental health and care home residents, you would only return journal articles that contain all of those words, all of those keywords. The problem with this is that you might get lucky and 2 or 3 articles might come back that are relevant to your study, but it's actually a very confined and contrived search phrase. The chances are that any other studies will have either used different words that mean the same thing. So like I said before, they might have said physical activity rather than exercise, or they might have said forest rather than green space, or they might have only dealt with 1 or 2 of the issues going on in your search term. So they won't come up because you will have excluded them through the use of your and Boolean logic. So the second search term that we can use through the Boolean logic is or. And or is used to return citations that contain one of the search terms. So going back to my example, I've decided my key terms are exercise, green space, mental health and care home residents. By putting or in between each of these, it means that I won't miss out studies that haven't dealt with every aspect that I want to deal with. So they might only be about exercise and mental health. They might only be about green space and care home residents. But by using the word or, I'm not going to eliminate articles that are relevant to my study from my search. Equally, as I was just saying, using or, we can actually broaden our search so that it includes words that mean the same thing, but say, for example, another academic has done a study on exactly what I want to study, but they've used the word physical activity instead of exercise. So I could write within my Boolean phraseology, I could write exercise or physical activity. I could write woods or green space, or I could write depression or mental health. And then all of the search terms would encapsulate all of those words rather than just one or two of them. So our final Boolean search technique is through the use of the word not. Now, not can be a bit dangerous in terms of Boolean phrasing because it can eliminate a lot of studies from your search results that might have been actually quite relevant. But if you've got hundreds and hundreds of articles that are returned because your search phrase is still quite broad, then using not can help to refine this further. So, for example, say when in my study on green space, actually I'm not that interested in woods, I'm only interested in finding out about the health benefits of taking part in physical activity in parks, then I would include parks, not woods. Equally, if I'm only interested in elderly care home residents but not people staying in hospitals, I would use care homes, not hospitals. So this would further refine my search results. So now you know the basics of when to use and, or, and not. You can start putting these together into whole phrases that you then enter into your search engine. So it could be Google Scholar, as I said before. Nesting is like building up equations in maths. It involves the use of brackets around your search terms, and within them you use different Boolean terms, so and, or, and not, and you build up a picture so that you have a very specific phrase that you then enter into your Google Scholar search engine or whatever it may be. Normally you'll go through quite a few different combinations of phrases and words, but make sure that every time you develop a new phrase, you keep that and you keep it written down so that you can then say when you're writing up your literature review that these are the search terms that you have used and where you have used them. The idea is, like I said earlier, it's all about being replicable and being rigorous. So the idea is that if anyone else went out and did exactly the same thing you just did, they would get the same results, other than, of course, any new publications that have come out since you did your literature review. So going back to my example research question, we can see that one way of using a nested phrase of Boolean terminology would be through using exercise or physical activity and green space or forests or parks and mental health or depression but not dementia and care home residents. And we can see how the more specific you are and the more you refine your search, technically the more accurate your results will be. But there is a danger that you will refine it to such an extent you'll actually end up not turning up anything in your search. If you find that that is the case and you've been so specific that you don't end up finding anything relevant, then rather than continually making your Boolean phraseology even more and more complicated, it's a good idea to actually just drop one of your keywords. Not drop it for the rest of the project, but just conduct a series of searches rather than trying to go for one almighty search that returns the best supposedly possible article. Actually take a few keywords out, potentially, depending on how many you have. So you only use 2 or 3 keywords, but do that using different keywords over and over again. Whilst this might seem a little bit messy, it might actually help you to structure your literature review later on. So for example, you might end up with a lot of research articles that talk about the relationship between exercise and mental health, And then you might also end up with a lot of research articles that talk about the effects of taking part in physical activity in green spaces. And combining those together is then your argument and your distinct approach that you are adding to what is already out there. So you found your gap in the literature that you are plugging. So you've got your Boolean logic now, and you can design quite sophisticated search phrases that should provide you with more accurate results when you're conducting your literature review search. There is one final thing that you can do to further broaden the results that you get and make sure that you don't end up unintentionally missing out on retrieving journal articles that would be relevant to your study but don't quite match the formatting that you've used. And that's through the use of the asterisks. So any word that potentially could have a different ending, you can subjugate with an asterisk, and then your search results will provide you with all of the variations of that word up to the point at which you put in the asterisk. So for example, if you wanted to search for any kind of phrasing that related to health, you could put an asterisk at the end of the word health, and then that search would return health and healthy and any other derivative of health that comes after the Boolean point. Another example would here be physics, as in you could cut off after the SI of physic, you would return physique, physical, physiology, physicality, but also you would get things that might not be relevant to your study, such as physics. If you knew physics and other such terms weren't going to be relevant to your study, then you could actually combine your use of the asterisk with Boolean logic. So you could enter physics with an asterisk and then enter not physics, etc. So you've got your research question, you've got your keywords or identifiers, or whatever you want to call them, and you've got your phrases that you're going to enter into your search engines. At what point do you stop searching for new journal articles and actually start concentrating on what you do have? Well, after a while you'll realise that the titles are getting quite similar. You're not turning up any new information despite putting in different variations of your search terms. So at this point you need to track both forwards and backwards. So tracking forwards, you can use in Google Scholar in particular, you can see everybody who has used the article you're looking at in their own work. And that's in the cited by section that can be seen under the title of the research article in the Google Scholar search engine. This can be really handy for scooping up all of the articles that you haven't found because they've slipped through your net. Equally, just as relevant, you can read the abstracts of all of the journal articles that are relevant to your study and sift through the ones that you think you want to keep, and then look through the reference lists of all of those journal articles, and again find any further references that you haven't managed to catch in your personal search. All of this information is quite practical and obvious, but unless you do all of it, you're not going to gain a systematic and comprehensive review, and there's going to be glaring holes in what you produce. So it's worthwhile considering both tracing forward and tracing back, and making sure you're really thorough at writing down all the different search terms you have used and the different search engines you've used to make sure that you can go back and replicate the study if you needed to. So you've got your keywords and you've got your Boolean logic, and hopefully you've got a nice sort of manageable number of about 30 to 40 journal articles that have come through to your search and that you could use for your literature review. Obviously that's still quite a lot, but you might actually find that you've got hundreds of journal articles depending on how specific you've been, or you might only find that you've got about 5 to 10. So at this stage, you need to decide whether you need to refine your findings further. You can refine your findings further through the database search engines, such as Google, where you can limit your search returns to only be from a particular time period. So you could limit your literature review to be really up to date. You could say all of my research findings are from between the dates of 2010 and 2016 as an example. Or you could say that you are only including journal articles that are in a particular publication language, which probably will happen anyway. Or you could refine it further by saying that you're only going to look at studies that use exactly the same demographic that you want to use for your personal project. Finally, you can start to refine your project, your findings further through the field of study. So obviously in health, there are quite a lot of topics that we study both scientifically and social scientifically. There might be a lot of clinical trials, there might be a lot of hard statistical data on physiology, on anatomy, that is kind of relevant and overlaps with what you want to do, but comes from a very scientific background. At this stage, if you've got an unmanageable array of information, you could decide between saying, actually, I'm only going to concentrate on the social scientific perspective. This is probably something you'd need to do by eye, unless you use a more sophisticated database search engine such as PubMed, and then you can start to refine by category of learning rather than just through age of the publication. As you will see from the examples that I've put onto Moodle of existing literature reviews in different fields, you need to be open about your screening criteria, so you can't just decide it yourself and not write about why you have chosen to refine your project in that way. So you will end up saying in your literature review, this literature review only deals with research that comes from a social scientific background and which was published between the dates of 2010 and 2016, for example. So the activity that I've put onto Moodle for you to do actually involves you doing the steps that we have just been through. It involves you refining your research project question and taking from that the keywords that you want to use and building them into a Boolean logic phrase, or several phrases as the case may be. It then involves you collecting a series of research publications through your use of different database search engines. So once you've done that, this is something that you don't have to do now, but obviously you will ultimately have to do for the assignment. Obviously you get to a stage where you have to actually write the literature review. But there's one step just before writing the literature review, which is analysing all of the information you've been given. In a way, a literature review is almost a little research project in its own right. It involves going out collecting data, i.e. your research findings that are in the form of research articles. You then analyse what is said within those research findings, and then you collate the information to build an argument. So it is almost a mini research project within a broader research project. You have to remember that when you write up your literature review, it's not a series of lists of what different articles said, but actually it involves you passing some kind of judgment on the quality of what has been written by other academics. So essentially you're critiquing or you're analysing what is already out there, and you're using that information to boost the impact and the rigour of your own personal study. So what you want to do is, once you've got your folder on your computer full of all of the PDF files of the journal articles that you have found through your database search, you want to go through each of those journal articles, not necessarily read them through thoroughly, but skim them so that you can summarise information on the research question and the topics being dealt with, the methods used and the sample that was used, the theoretical background that the academics relied upon, whether you have already noticed any links between this particular journal that you're reading and the other ones that you've already also downloaded and put within your folder for later looking, and key results or conclusions that come from each of your journal articles. At this stage, you want to keep your notes really quite brief because you don't get the opportunity to say much about any one journal article, and the more you write about at this stage, the more difficult it is to then synthesize your findings into a coherent argument. So once you've made notes on each of your journal articles that you've turned up through your search results, you need to start thinking about the order in which you'll use them. Before you do actually use them, it's a good idea to assign every journal article that you have downloaded and decided is worthy of being included, and assign it a number, and then every key point or note that you have made on that journal article, you assign that a letter. So for example, you would have article 1, note B, and then we'll get to how this influences the process of writing out your literature review in a minute. Once you've read through everything that you've got, to varying degrees of criticality, you need to think about the structure that you want to write your literature review in. So, with your summarised notes fresh in your mind, you might want to identify what the predominant field and or paradigmatic and theoretical approach existing literature emanates from. So it might be, if you've got, say, 20 articles, 15 of those are all coming from a positivist background, or 12 of them are coming from an interpretivist background, or, 15 of them are involving some kind of Foucauldian theory. It's worth making notes of those bigger pictures. With all of this information fresh in your head, you'll also be able to remember any key trends that the research is producing. So it might be that a lot of articles are saying roughly the same thing. You can synthesize those into one clear paragraph. And finally, you want to identify what the gaps are in the research. Once you've read through quite a few journal articles, you'll have an idea of what has and hasn't been done. With all of this knowledge in mind, you can start to create a draft skeleton for your review that builds a case for your project idea. It's a good idea to do this in a table because then you can slot in all of the notes that you've made up to this point and rearrange them until you're happy with the order that they are in. Ultimately, you'll need to build quite a broader picture when it comes to your dissertation than you will do for assignment number 2. So your literature review will ultimately involve a series of mini literature reviews that each deal with a different sub-theme to create a story or a case for why your project is important. So in this sense, going back to my example of the research question, does exercise in green space improve mental well-being for healthcare home residents? You might be inclined to firstly provide an overview of the prevalence of mental health issues in care home settings, to highlight how and why your project is important and will have an impact. So going back to the so what of our research question. Then you might want to identify existing studies that identify the relationship between physical activity and mental health. So both positive research findings and inconclusive research findings. And then you might want to do the same for studies that concentrate on the relationship between mental health and physical activity, so that you build up, first of all, an impact, a so what, and then a broader understanding of what's going on at the moment. It's quite a nice idea to save the studies that are really close to what you want to do and use these, almost frame them as pioneering studies that are out there that are starting to bring together the two bodies of literature we've just introduced. So, for example, we might write something along the lines of, as can be seen, extensive research has covered the links between physical activity and mental health, and spending time in green space and mental health. However, research combining these, whilst evident, is less voluminous in nature. However, notable examples in this field are studies produced by whoever the people may be, and you summarise a collective of these people. This way, you've provided initially an impact why your study is important, in other words, to make the lives of people living in care homes better. Then you provide an overview of the links between mental health and green space and mental health and physical activity. And then you say, studies like yours are actually quite pioneering and there's not much literature out there that combines all of these things together. So you've built a clear case of why your project is important, why there's a gap for it, and how it already situates itself within the context of what's already out there. So these key subsections that I've just identified through my example study provide what you could call a skeleton for you to drape the rest of your research findings, as in your literature research findings, onto. So you can populate each section of these with the article notes that you've already made. As I said already, it's a good idea to number and letter all of the research notes you've made. So all of the articles have a number, and then all of the notes related to that article have a letter. Because then you can order them and fit them into the subheadings that you've just determined are relevant to your literature review. If you create this table in a Word document, you can rearrange the order until you're happy with it. You can reuse the same points if they're appropriate in multiple places. You can compare and contrast different points, and you can also sit your own research project within these. Just to clarify, looking at the table that I've put on the slide here, the categories on the left are what I would use as the subtitles that form the skeletal structure of my literature review on the topic of does exercise in green space improve mental well-being for care home residents? Now you've developed quite a specific structure for your literature review, you need to still make sure that you cover these key topics at some point or over the course of that literature review. So to get high marks for criticality and synthesis, you still need to consider conflicting opinions that are coming through your journal articles, variations in approaches to the same topic, so that could be methodological, it could be theoretical. Also changes in approach and opinion over time. It might be that actually the types of methods used have evolved over time. It might be that what we once thought was true actually no longer we're deciding is true. So you can chart that change as you go and slot it into the broader structure of your argument. When you come to your conclusion, you should always summarise the key points that you've made throughout, but also identify what you will take from these studies, as in the best bits of them that you think worked, and how you can use them in your own research project, or what will be to follow in the rest of the dissertation document. What your project does differently to these studies, so you might have identified bad practice, or you just might decide that you want to try something new and out there and innovative. So that's where you say how your project is different. And also the broader context of why your project is different. It might be that you're using your project within an environment that's never been studied in. So, for example, you could have lots of interventions may exist on basketball and immigration. Potentially, your project is going to do the same thing within a different sporting context. Once you've got your structure and you've got your table and you've populated it with all of the notes that you've made through your use of numbers and letters, your keys, you might start to think about writing it up. Just a point on how you cite in a literature review. You want to move away from using big quotes, particularly block quotations, and even smaller quotations are somewhat frowned upon. So the whole point of this exercise is that you're supposed to be showing that you've engaged with a wide variety of sources, and you don't actually have that many words to play around with to do that. So paraphrasing and generalization are going to be the most appropriate ways to cite your references in your literature review, because you can combine lots of different sources into one point without having to use up your words on what different authors said. So here we've just got some examples illustrating what I mean by the difference between blocks and sentence quotations, block quotations, paraphrasing and summarizing, and generalizations. But most of what you want to be doing is generalizing. So you want to write succinctly in the literature review and group together different journal articles at the end of each sentence. Having said that, whilst you want to really write succinctly and combine the work of lots of different authors on the same topic into one or two sentences, you have to still be true to what they are saying as far as possible. So here's a couple of examples. Much has been written about the effects of poverty by Krauss 2003, or the relationship between poverty and health has been extensively studied in recent years. So does this mean that Krauss has written or studied a lot about this himself, or has he made an analysis of the writings, or has he compiled a list of relevant literature? You need to write more precisely to avoid making such claims that are somewhat ambiguous. So another issue is to watch for the accuracy of your summaries, the ideas, and the fairness of the evaluation of the writings of others. So you need to make the judgment as to the amount of information given to provide an accurate impression of the original, and to paraphrase it in such a way as not to mislead or misrepresent the work. In other words, just be quite obvious and quite clear about what you're trying to say. So instead of saying much has been written about the effects of poverty, Krauss 2003, you could write Krauss 2003 has widely written about the effects of poverty. This clears up any misconceptions, and it doesn't have to narrow you to using only one author per sentence. You could write something similar along the lines of poverty has been widely discussed amongst the literature. Key academics working in this field are Krauss and then whoever else might be working in that field. So just think about how you write it up and try and be true to what the people were originally saying. Right, so hopefully from this you've learnt something about how to conduct your search using a new approach that potentially you haven't explored Boolean logic before. And you can obviously use this in all of your assignments, so hopefully it will prove useful for more than just your literature review and assignment too. So your search results should be more accurate from now on. You've learnt how to determine keywords from a broader research question. And we've also provided you with some information on how best to write up your literature review in terms of using very synthesized and very concise writing styles rather than listing lots of information from different sources, one after the other. I would encourage you also to use some kind of system, as the one I've used as an example, for making notes and storing your articles that you find through doing your database searches. Otherwise things can get quite messy and you don't know what you've read, what you haven't read, where it's come from and where your notes are from, which can also lead to plagiarism quite easily. But just to recap on the key points that I want you to take away from this online lecture. Make sure your review isn't just a list of previous research without an assessment of quality and interconnections. So it's all about looking at how one article relates to other articles and your own opinions. Can't stress that enough. That is what synthesis means, and that is what you're being judged on all the time in your research practice and your other assignments. Cover key developments in your research area. Don't just provide a chronological account. So you really need to make sure that you're covering all the bases of where you want your project to go later on. Make sure your review is theoretically informed and use the existing theoretical stance of existing work to validate your own approach to the topic. So you could believe that actually what's already been done is being done really well, and you want to replicate that to a certain extent and show your innovation through either methodology or context, or you may decide that actually a lot of research is emanating from a critical theoretical position and you want to move into an interpretivist position. And finally, make sure you're aware of the dominant methodological approaches to validate your research design. So this is the same point, but just in relation to methodology. So either mirror a successful methodological approach or challenge tradition to gain data that is different in some way. Right, so that's the end of the lecture proportion. Today it's been very practical. Hopefully it's skills that you can use in other assignments as well. Next week's considerably more conceptual, yeah, so as a result, also the activity is quite practical. Have a look on the Moodle site where this lecture was situated. There is also an activity. The activity, you can either do it directly in Moodle if you're going to dedicate a period of time to doing it once you open Moodle, or you can download and fill in the word template that I've put on the same part of Moodle. Fill it in your own time over however long it takes you to do it, and then just go back to the online activity and copy and paste the sections that you've filled in the word template and put them into the online version, just like you would do with like a job application or something. It just makes sure you don't end up losing information halfway through the activity. Remember, completing the activity marks you as present for this lecture and illustrates that you have engaged with the material and that you should be readily positioned to go out and conduct a very good literature review in the future. You have until midnight on the 23rd of February to complete the online activity, which is actually over a week away. So yeah, not in too much of a hurry to be doing that. Anyway, I will see you soon and good luck with the first online version of this class.